Cyan grabbed Seth by the leg and threw him with all his strength to the ground. But to his bad luck, Seth was not willing to give up and lose so easily. Just before Seth's body could hit the ground, at the last second he placed his hand on the ground and prevented his body from impacting against it. Due to the force he was exerting, the ground broke into pieces. While his sweat was falling from his face, he clenched his teeth tightly and with a murderous look, began to stare at the ground and decided not to give up so easily. While Seth had his hands supported on the ground, he turned his head towards Cyan, and using the momentum, forcefully shook his leg, causing Cyan to let go of him. In the process, Seth tried to attack him, but he reacted in time and quickly moved his head to one side, dodging the attack. Then, he turned his head slightly towards Seth, and couldn't help but smile as Seth had retaliated in a brief moment. For being so big in size, he was quite fast. Seeing that Seth had been able to defend himself from Cyan's attack, the students were shocked. A brown-haired boy started looking at Seth with a surprised look and couldn't help but wonder what move he had made to dodge the attack. A girl with pink hair who was sitting next to him put her hand near her mouth and began to question whether Seth was really human. While Seth had one hand and one knee on the ground, he placed his other hand on his other knee and simply started looking down. Cyan approached him and stood still, waiting to see what his next move would be. While his sweat was falling to the ground, he couldn't help but smile and feel excited. He lifted his head, started staring at Cyan and began laughing out loud. Not far from him lay his sword on the ground. Far from picking it up again, Seth admitted defeat in swordsmanship. He stood up, extended his hands to the sides, and his body began to emit a powerful energy. With a killer look in his eyes, he started staring at Cyan. Now that he had come this far, he was going to have to win no matter the method. With a smile, he decided to use everything he had. While Cyan had the rapier resting on his shoulder, he began looking at Seth and with a forced smile thought that he was a tiresome person. Seth adopted an offensive stance, slightly shifted his foot to the side, and exerted so much force that he destroyed part of the floor into pieces. He advised Cyan to go all out as well. At that moment, he extended his hands to the sides and his body began to emit a powerful energy which destroyed part of the stadium and some of his own clothes. While his eyes were shining, he began to stare at Cyan and with a smile asked him to get ready. The dean, who was also present in the stadium and was watching the duel attentively. While he was stroking his beard, he began to question whether now the two of them were planning to have a magic duel. He started staring at Cyan and Seth intently and couldn't help but think that they were bold children. He had never thought that they would fight using only sword skills and then only magic. Sarika, who was standing next to the dean and also observing the duel, began to look at Cyan with a serious gaze, explaining to the dean that Cyan had already defeated Seth in swordsmanship sparring. Upon hearing this, with a calm expression, the dean also started observing Cyan and agreed with Sarika's explanation. Seth had a physical rating of rank A, while Cyan Vert had a physical rating of rank S. This was a fact considering their physical ratings. With a serious look, the dean began to stare at Cyan. He was the first one to know that Cyan and Seth had a good physical rating. However, one's physique was nothing more than a basic component for mastering higher levels of magic. Seth's magical level was 3 stars, the highest among all the rookies. With a questioning look, the dean began to wonder what Cyan was going to do now and how he would face this situation. While he was lost in his thoughts, Sarika, who was sitting beside him, started looking down at the floor. Unconsciously, her body began emitting a powerful and evil aura. She was very angry with Cyan. She began to look at Cyan with a gaze full of anger, clenched her teeth tightly, and asked him why he didn't tell the whole world that he wanted their attention. At that moment, part of the stadium floor broke into pieces and a giant hand made of sand emerged from the ground. This hand had been summoned by Seth, who had his hands extended to the sides and was staring fixedly at Cyan. This ability was called Death Fist. Seth clenched his fist tightly, and with a smile, decided it was time to attack. Upon seeing this, Cyan simply put the rapier on his shoulder, put his other hand in his pants pocket, started staring intently at Seth and wondered if they should now fight with magic. Seth controlled the giant hand made of sand and attacked Cyan, but with little effort, he jumped to the side and dodged the attack, causing the hand to hit the ground. He slightly turned his head towards the attack and came to the conclusion that Seth was quite strong. He thought he had escaped the attack, but at that moment, something hidden just beneath his feet began to emerge. With a deadly look, Seth reached out his hand towards the sky and told Cyan that this time he was not going to let him escape. At that moment, Seth attacked Cyan again, causing the giant hand to emerge from the ground once more. But to Seth's misfortune, Cyan was already aware of this. He sheathed his sword and began running, dodging the attacks in the process. Seeing this, Seth reached out a hand towards him, gripping his arm with the other one. With a penetrating gaze, he used the desert tooth technique. While Cyan was dodging the attacks, sand began to emerge from the ground. Upon seeing this, he abruptly stopped and quickly realized that something bad was about to happen. In the blink of an eye, the sand started coming out of the ground, surrounding Cyan from all sides. He simply turned his head to the side, started looking at Seth, and remembered that his mana range was evaluated as 3 stars. At that moment, a sand barrier was created around Cyan's body, creating a big explosion of sand in the process. Several seconds later, once the smoke curtain began to disappear, it could be seen that Cyan had dodged the attack at the last second. He remained still for several seconds, and with a calm look, he came to the conclusion that considering the power of this attack, Seth should be able to even use 4-star magic. After thinking about this, Cyan slightly turned his head back and saw several instructors nearby, who were wearing hoods and creating a protective barrier around the area. He realized that the instructors maintaining the barrier might be having a difficult time. Several seconds later, once the smoke cleared, Seth could be seen standing in an offensive pose. He had his hands extended to the sides and was looking towards the ground. He couldn't help but get angry when he saw Cyan continue to flee like a little rat from his attacks. He asked Cyan how long he planned on running. Upon hearing this, Cyan became somewhat confused. He thought that Seth wasn't very smart, so he asked if he should have faced the attacks directly then. Upon hearing Cyan's question, Seth became even more furious. He started looking at Cyan with a gaze full of anger, clenched his teeth tightly, and called him little kid, explaining that a warrior would not have dodged them. Cyan became even more confused. He began to look at Seth and reminded him that he too was a child. Seth got tired of hearing Cyan so much, so he clenched his fist tightly, began to extend it towards Cyan, and with a penetrating look, used the ability called Sandstorm. Upon seeing the ability Seth was using, the dean was left speechless, thinking that he was quite a peculiar student. Sarika stood up and, upon seeing Seth's ability, panicked. She didn't know how he was using a 4-star spell. She had thought Seth's mana rank was only 3 stars. Seth extended his fist towards Cyan, unleashing a powerful mana blast at him. He believed that Cyan wouldn't be able to dodge this attack. Seth had used so much mana that his shirt tore into pieces. While little by little the mana blast was getting closer to Cyan, he dropped his arms, clenched his fists tightly, and decided to listen to Seth. In the blink of an eye, the mana blast reached him. He simply started looking at Seth, and with a smile decided to face this attack directly. At the same time in the royal hall, Brian prepared a bottle of milk for the baby dragon. He took the bottle, poured a little milk on his arm, and with a smile thought that the temperature was perfect. He couldn't help but feel happy to have some experience taking care of babies. Brian remembered his past when he was young. He used to take care of his younger siblings. Although it had been a bit annoying for him back then, he didn't expect it to be so useful now. While holding the milk bottle with one hand, he brought the other hand close to his mouth, closed his eyes, and with a joyful voice called the baby dragon, calling her princess and letting her know it was time to eat. At that moment, she appeared, and upon seeing this, Brian's expression changed drastically. He couldn't believe what his eyes were seeing. She had grown so much in such a short time. Now she was even able to walk, and that's only been a few days since she was born. Upon hearing the word food, she turned her head towards him and with a tender expression asked him where it was. At the same time, in the stadium where the duel between Cyan and Seth was taking place, Seth attacked him using the mana blast. It spread throughout the magic barrier, making the students sitting in the stadium unable to see what was happening inside. Seth's attack was so powerful that within seconds, the magical barrier began to crack. Upon seeing this, the instructors panicked. One of them, with his hand extended to the side, turned his body towards his companion and informed him that the protective barrier was on the verge of breaking. He then gave him the order to reinforce it. The other man, who had one hand extended towards the protective barrier and the other on top of his arm, clenched his teeth tightly and began to wonder how it was possible that only 2 students were so strong. Little by little, the magical barrier started to break. Upon seeing this, the instructor panicked, started sweating, clenched his teeth tightly, and asked his colleague what the dean was doing and if he couldn't see how serious this was. At the same time, Sarika stood up, approached the dean, and with a serious look asked him to stop the duel right now. While he was watching the duel, in a calm voice he asked her to wait. Then, he started staring at Cyan and told her that something was happening. At the same time, inside the magic barrier, Cyan reached out to one side and used the secret technique expansion called Void Sphere, causing a sphere of darkness to appear in the palm of his hand. Upon seeing this, Sarika's expression changed drastically. With a surprised look, she realized what this ability was and asked Cyan to stop and not use this skill. In the blink of an eye, the darkness began to absorb the mana blast that Seth had conjured. The dean started stroking his beard and was surprised. Cyan was surprising him over and over again in this fight. Sarika stood up, placing both hands on the table. She began to stare fixedly at Cyan and couldn't help but get angry. She started wondering why he had used this ability here. In a matter of seconds, the sphere of darkness began to absorb the mana blasts that were inside the magical barrier. Once the sphere of darkness absorbed all the mana blasts, Cyan clenched his fist tightly, causing the sphere of darkness to disappear. Seth, who had both hands extended towards Cyan, was left speechless due to the large amount of mana he had used. Now he was very tired. The bald student who was watching the duel crossed his arms and began to wonder why the spell had suddenly disappeared. A girl, with both hands close to her chest, became terrified and asked her friend if that black sphere was also magical. A black-haired boy who had his arms resting on his knees was left speechless. He had never heard of magic like the one Cyan had used. While Cyan's fist was releasing dark magic, he put his other hand in his pants pocket, turned his head towards Seth and with a calm look asked him if he wanted to keep fighting. Seth, who was dead tired, began to look at Cyan, opened his mouth and started breathing heavily to catch his breath. Far from continuing to fight, he decided to accept defeat. In a matter of seconds, Seth fell to his knees on the ground, bowed his head before Cyan and couldn't believe what was happening. Upon hearing this, Cyan was somewhat surprised and began wondering what he was talking about. Seth lifted his head, and while his eyes were shining, he began to look at Cyan and explained to him that now he was depressed since he had lost in both swordsmanship and magic. Cyan was somewhat surprised and confused at the same time. He couldn't help but feel a little bad for Seth. He didn't know if he had defeated him too one-sidedly. Seth forcefully hit the ground with his fist, breaking it into pieces. Then, he opened the palm of his hand and, while his eyes were shining, he began to stare at it intently. With a smile, he felt motivated by the defeat since he was quite tired of fighting against weaklings anyway. Upon seeing Seth's attitude, Cyan was somewhat surprised and confused at the same time. He couldn't help but think that Seth was a very strange guy. Seth stood up, extended his hand towards Cyan, began to look him in the eyes, and with a joyful smile told him that he didn't know when it would be, but he wanted to fight against him again. Cyan also started looking at him in the eyes and remained silent. Seth hoped that Cyan would also accept the challenge. Cyan shook Seth's hand and refused to accept his challenge. Several hours later, Cyan returned to the royal hall, and his dragon daughter approached him. She had grown up and was now wearing a little girl's dress, with a joyful smile on her face as she welcomed her dad. He couldn't help but be surprised, even though he knew that a dragon's growth spurt was faster than that of humans. Despite being born just a few days ago, she seemed to be around 6 years old now. He put his hands in his pants pockets. He began to look at her with a surprised look, and upon seeing that even a dragon-human hybrid was growing so fast, he concluded that she would soon appear to be the same age as him. Not far away, Kerem was sleeping on the couch. While the dragon girl was playing, Brian approached Cyan, placed one hand on his waist and the other on his head, and told him that she continued to grow so quickly. He put both hands on his waist, turned his head towards her, and told Brian that it was going to be harder now to raise her in secret with how quickly she was growing. At that moment, someone entered the royal hall and told Cyan that eventually he wouldn't be able to hide her anymore. Upon hearing the voice, his expression changed drastically and he went on high alert. This voice belonged to Sarika, who had her back against the door and was touching her glasses with her hand. Cyan turned his body towards her. She could help hide the demonic sword, but she couldn't help him hide a draconic human. She put 2 fingers of her hand near her chin, started looking at Cyan with an aggressive look, clenched her teeth tightly and told him that she couldn't help him if he lost control like he did today. After saying this, she asked him what the hell he was thinking. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.